Okay. All right. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, I guess, to Jason. My name is Kerstin Martens. I'm moderating this session this morning. I'm from the University of Bremen in Germany, and we are one of the 4 universities which take part in this Global program. Today is the second day of the, what is it, the spring school instead of the winter school. We just decided to call it that way. And I hope everyone is doing well. And today we are going to listen to a talk by Jason Beech. Jason Beech is a senior lecturer in education policy at Monash University. Monash University is in Melbourne. I actually would have said Sydney, so I looked it up. That's a problem about these Australian universities. They never have the name of the city. They always are called Western Australian, Queensland, or whatever. So you really have to dig deep, you know, where it actually is located. So Jason is interested in studying and researching global discourses and how these global discourses are then also translated into national policies and practices. So I guess that's also why you are invited for this year's school, because it fits very well to the topic we have here, this dynamics of global and local translations, basically. And he also looks at international organizations like UNESCO, OECD, and also for-profit organizations. So that's also where I know him from, because that's similar to the research I'm doing. And he's an expert for Latin American countries. So he did a lot of work on Argentina, on Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Costa Rica. And are you still the UNESCO chair at St. Andres? Okay, because we talked a little bit informally, and you said you just moved to Melbourne.
Yeah, but I have that position there.
Okay, so that's also very typical for academic life. You never know where these people are, you know, where they are affiliated and what they're doing currently. So you've also taught at several universities in the Americas, in Europe, and then Australia. I saw you were in Lund University at some point, and your address was Professorengatan, which I found very interesting, because that means street of professors. That's where you were located when I was researching you in preparation for today. So, and you've published widely in the top education journals. I guess we could play a game here, basically, in the sense that I name a journal and you name, you know, when you published in it and what your article was about. But we're not going to do this today, but we'll actually listening to your presentation today. I think it somehow combines your different interests very well, because it's on exploring the recontextualization of global educational discourses, respect for diversity, and the cultural politics of ethnic relations in Latin America. So, Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristen, very much. I'm going to, well, before I share the screen, a few things. So thanks very much for the invitation, all of you here, Lefteris and Xavi, Kristen, well, everybody who's, I don't know who's exactly involved in the organization. It's a big pleasure I would have preferred to be there in person, either in Barcelona or in Cyprus or in Germany, why not? But well, at least we can connect through Zoom, and it's really nice, because I know that for the students, I know that you've been listening and having a conversation with Bob Cowan yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yeah. Well, and there's a nice history there, because Bob was my supervisor and Lefteri's supervisor also at the same time at the Institute of Education, and so that brings me great memories. And hopefully you can somehow connect the conversation you had yesterday with Bob with the kind of things I'm going to talk about today, because we do come from similar backgrounds. Well, not similar backgrounds, but I come from having learned a lot of what I know from Bob together with Lefteris. So what I'll do today is basically, my presentation, I will start by defining what I mean and giving some examples of what I mean by global educational discourses. And I'll give you an idea of what I mean by the notion of recontextualization. And then after that very brief theoretical part, I will move on to the case I want to present to kind of have this discussion, bring this discussion down empirically, and I'll talk a little bit about coloniality in the Americas, so the specific situation of colonialism and post-colonialism in the Americas. Just a few notes for you to understand better the cases, and then I'll talk about Bolivia and Argentina, and again, only just some vignettes for you to understand how modernization processes occurred very differently in these two places, and how then that affected the way in which the notion of respect for diversity since the 1990s has been interpreted in these two countries, which in a way I'm using as examples of like very diverse kind of demographics and populations in terms of ethnicity in Latin America. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So first, a very brief theoretical point about the notion of discourse and global educational discourses. So you see there a picture of my good intellectual friend Michel Foucault, who saved me a few times. And so when I use the notion of discourse, I'm using it based on Foucault's notion of discourse. Discourse is a concept that has been used in many different ways in the literature. So that's where I'm locating it. And discourse is a form for Foucault, it's a form of power and knowledge. So he sees power and knowledge as two sides of the same coin. And basically he looks at how, and that's what I'm going to try to do today, how through knowledge and through the ways in which the language we have, the ways in which we describe the world, we also construct the world. And in that way, knowledge becomes power. So the way in which we think about the world affects very much what we can do and how we can act upon that world. So in a more formal way, we can think of discourse as meaning systems that have gained the status of truth. So from this perspective, there's not such thing as an absolute truth out there to be found in kind of like in more, well, whatever, in religious discourse or in more positivistic discourses, but rather truth is the site of a battle to define what is true and what is not. And so these meaning systems dominate how we define and organize both ourselves and our social world. This all sounds very complicated, but I think with an example, I can explain this a little bit better. So here what we have is, I don't know if you know this tool, this is called the Google N-gram-N, as in night gram viewer. And what you can do with that is like, you put a word or a concept, and it will tell you how many times that concept is used in all the texts that Google has digitalized. So mainly we can use it as a proxy of how much that notion is being used in the literature. And here I use the concept of learning disabilities to show how, if you look until the 1960s, mid-1960s, this concept didn't exist. And then it exploded. It became very, very important in the literature. And we started naming something, some kind of conduct as learning disabilities. So what happened? Did learning disabilities exist in the 1950s? And of course, the kind of conduct or the kind of behavior that we now define as learning disabilities existed, but we named it in a different way. Okay, so we had like kids in Spanish, typically we call them burros, no donkeys. We would call them like people that don't know. It's a bad student, the student that is has to be sent outside. No, he or she can't understand. But from the moment we start naming that as learning disabilities, our conduct changes. The way in which we approach that changes. There's certain things that we cannot say and do anymore. We cannot hit that student. We cannot take him out of the class. So a new way of approaching that comes. And so when we name it in a different way, when this concept of learning disability comes into our language, and of course, there's a lot of political reasons of why that happened in the 60s and the 70s, but I'm not going to get into those details. The way in which we treat a student that doesn't understand is completely different. New technologies come into play. So now you have like what in Spanish we call psicopedagogas. I don't know how in English, I think it doesn't exist, but these kind of new professions come into place of people that are work with students that have learning disabilities, new technologies, new kinds of tests, new ways of thinking about this, new ways, of course, solving the issue. So this is an example to show you how the way in which we name the world, the way in which we name the issues that happen around us affects very much the way in which we act upon them. There's a fascinating paper, or well, many papers by an author called Ian Hacking that explains this very well. One in particular is called Making Up People, which I strongly recommend, and he explains it much better than I do. So in a way, discourse doesn't only, or if we can think of discourse as language, doesn't only describe reality, but it also constructs reality. So we can think now a very big discussion we're having globally about sustainability. So if we define, for example, a forest or whatever, a given part of what as a natural resource of the planet, as a natural resource, this idea, this is a resource, this is something we can go, we can appropriate, we can use. Now, if we define it as a common good, it becomes a completely different way in which so now something that's happening in terms of power and discursive power is we're having very big discussions and debates about how we name natural resources, what we used to call natural resources. Another big change that happened in most, at least Western countries, in the last few decades or years is the way in which violence against women, for example, is being named. No, the femicides, for example, that changes completely. There's a new institutions, new ways of treating that. Okay, and of course that has to do with the fight of collective fights of women for their rights, etc. So I hope these examples kind of are useful to understand what we mean by discourse and what I mean when I talk about discourse and the power that language has in the ways in which we define and think about. And of course, we can think about a lot of educational examples, and I'll give you a few examples now. So discourse defines a certain possibilities and limits in terms of what can be said and thought and who can talk with authority. Again, the example of women is very clear, at least, for example, in a place like Argentina, a lot of people that usually men, that worked in radio shows, making jokes, lost their jobs. The kind of things they said was not acceptable. In Foucauldian terms, they were outside of discourse. They were considered, you're not in this culture. We can't accept that, what you're saying. And so, again, it's what you can say and what you can't say in a given moment. And of course, this is dynamic, both in different places and in different moments in history. And the other thing is that we need to think about power knowledge. This discourse as productive. Power, this is something very important in Foucauldian theory, is not only what represses us, but also what produces. It produces, as I showed with learning disability, it produces practices, it produces profession, it produces technologies. So when you look at education policies, for example, the idea, no, the policy was resisted. Yeah, but okay, maybe, but in that resistance, something was produced. There were new alliances, new discourses, new ways of thinking about something. So for example, here we have a few examples. This book here, you can see my mouse? Yes, no? This book here on the left of the screen by David Tyack and Larry Cuban, they created a wonderful concept. I think they were the ones that created it, of the grammar of schooling. So if you go or whatever to a very strange place for you, say for me, would be like a small town in the middle of the African sub-Saharan continent, which I've never been there, I'll probably recognize the school because there's certain grammar of the school, certain idea of there's young people, there's desks, there's going to be something similar to a blackboard, etc. We can recognize the way in which space, and that has been diffused all over the globe, all over the world. The other one on my right is the work by John Mayer, Aaron Benavot, and others about curriculum in primary education. They looked at the curriculum in primary education in hundreds of countries, and what they found is that the curriculum for primary education is almost the same, at least at that big level of generalization in terms of the subjects that are taught: arithmetics, the mother language, some kind of natural sciences, later on social sciences, citizenship, and some kind of physical education. So again, these are global discourses that have been diffused and have made educational systems very similar in many ways around the world. But of course, we have to remember that this doesn't mean that education systems or education discourses are exactly the same in different parts of the world, because these global ideas get then recontextualized. As they move from one place to another, they are transformed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go into detail into looking about a specific case and comparing Argentina and Bolivia in terms of how they recontextualize, how they translated the idea of respect for diversity. So you were talking to, you were having a conversation with Bob yesterday, and he mentioned this his idea of the 3 T's, I assume, no, the idea of transfer. So discourses are transferred, they move from one place to another, but they're also translated. They become a new kind of discourse as they interact with other discourses. They are translated. Okay, so again, you can think of and then of course they are transformed. They are transformed into something different. So a good example, a very clear example is, for example, the notion of inclusion that has become very, very widely used today in global discourses in education, and it's binary exclusion. So what does inclusion, educational inclusion, mean? It will mean very different things in very different places. So if you probably go to South Africa, inclusion will be immediately linked to the bads of apartheid, and would be related to race and to recovering from all these problems with ethnic tensions that South Africa had, which you probably, at least at a superficial level, all know about. If you go to a place like Argentina, where we had like very bad economic policies, and poverty grew from around 7% in the 70s to 50% in the 90s, or maybe now. Inclusion is very much related to poverty and to the issues related to socioeconomic status. If you go to a place like Australia, inclusion is very much related to the indigenous community. So what does inclusion exclusion mean? Probably in places like Germany, Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very much related to maybe migrant families, and again, doesn't mean that only with that, but how it is translated has to do with culture, politics. So how are culture, politics, economics defined in those places? So who is included, who is excluded, is going to be very different in different parts of the world. So I hope with this you have an idea of what I mean by global educational discourses, how they have been diffused around the world, and how then they are transformed, or transferred, translated, and transformed, as Bob would say, in different parts of the world. I won't go into too much detail with the notion of recontextualization now, because that's exactly what I'm going to try to show you with these empirical cases, and we're going to pick on this in the conclusion. So now we're going to move into this we could call it a case study, if you want, about respect for diversity and the cultural politics of ethnic relations in Latin America. And I'm going to use Bolivia and Argentina as 2 examples, but I'm not saying at all that what happened in Bolivia and Argentina happened exactly the same in other parts of Latin America, but it does show the kind of the spectrum of 2 very different ways in which this notion of respect for diversity, that became a very notable global slogan in the 1990s, and still is, has been interpreted in these places. So if we think of respect for diversity, it has become this global slogan. I mean, I'm sure I would invite all of you to go tomorrow, or whenever you have some time, into the web pages of most ministries of education, or whatever they're called in different parts of the world, and see if you don't find some kind of reference to the idea of respect for diversity. It's a little bit old, so it has been translated now, for example, into the notion of inclusion and others, but it's still very much used. It became a common sense way of thinking about education. It became a very important way of how ministries of education, but also teachers and teacher education courses, and many other institutions thought about education. And how do these slogans get constructed? Well, there's some interesting work by Manuel Castells on this kind of how of these global spaces and how these notions become abstracted from place-based historical experience. So we could think, what are the origins? Where does the notion of respect for diversity come from? And I don't know, I could name the civil rights movements in the US, for example, as an important moment in time where the idea of, we could say that their respect for diversity was being discussed. But also we can think of postmodern reaction and the kind of the white man burden in places like the UK and in many parts of Europe and the US. We could think of feminist movements, gay movements, so many movements that promoted in many different ways the notion of respect for diversity. Is very difficult to pinpoint, okay, this is where it's coming from. And maybe in general, it has to do with a change of era, a change of how we think about the other. But anyway, what's important for us as a global discourse is that it has become a kind of floating signifier. It becomes a global slogan that is very much open to a multiplicity of meanings and interpretations, which are going to depend on the context to which this slogan arrives. So what types of diversity should we respect? Is going to be a discussion that is going to have very different results in very different places. So which ones should we prioritize? And when I say in different places, I don't mean only in different countries, for example, but even within a different country, different political actors might use the notion of respect for diversity for their own interests. Okay, so just to give you an example, the Catholic Church in Argentina was against the legalization of gay marriage. Of course, gay movements and their supporters used the idea of respect for diversity as an instrument to gain power in seeking that marriages, same-sex marriages, were legalized. But for the Catholic Church, at least that was not a kind of diversity that should be respected, or at least not to the extreme of letting those people get married. But at the same time, the Catholic Church uses the notion of respect of diversity to be able to run their own schools and be financed by the state. So what kind of respect, what kind of diversity should be respected, and how it's going to change very much in different places, but not only don't think of this only in terms of countries, but also in terms of political actors, for example. And of course, it's not only what does diversity mean, but what does respect mean? Okay, and there's a whole discussion there, and of course, the work of well, it's late, I can't remember now. But there's a lot of very interesting work in terms of the notion of respect and the notion of recognition. Nancy Fraser, the famous philosopher, feminist philosopher, and what does recognition mean in different parts. So now we're going to move this discussion particularly into Latin America. And there's a few, I offered you some readings, which I mean, it doesn't matter if you did them, if you read them or not at this stage, but a few authors like Walter Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano that talk about the notion of the colonial difference. And basically what they mean by this in very simple words is that we cannot, like most post-colonial theories came from Asia, and this was like in the 50s, 60s, when the post-colonial processes were happening there. And what these people are saying is that be careful with the notion of colonial or of coloniality, because not every part of the world had the same colonial experience. It's very, very different in different parts of the world. So, for example, if you look at the Americas, not even Latin America, the Americas as a whole, there's a huge difference in how they lived coloniality, because the Americas were colonized much earlier than East Asian or African countries, and independence was much earlier. So, for example, a good example of this is looking at modernization. Process of modernization happened in Europe while the Americas were already a colony. So they happened almost at the same time in both places, in a way. with a lot of differences. But it's not that the colonization of the Americas happened as a result of modernization, but it happened before, and it had to do with other things. The other thing that implies a big difference, and this is very important for my argument as I look at Argentina and Bolivia, is that in the Americas there was a very weak rupture between the colonial system and independence. So when independence came to the Americas, and from the Canada all the way to Chile and Argentina, the people who took the power were not the indigenous communities, were not the locals from the Americas, but it was the Creole elite. So it was the sons, I was going to say sons and daughters, but not the daughters at those times, the sons of the Spaniards or the English or the French or whatever in different parts of the Americas that took control of those governments. And they acted as mediators with the world system and with Western modern epistemes, Western modern knowledges and institutions. So they aimed at creating kind of Western style nation states with all the bureaucracy and all the different, including education systems. But these were not indigenous people that took control, except for the very big exception is Paraguay, but that's another story. I won't talk about that today. So indigenous peoples and indigenous epistemes, let's just simplify and talk about indigenous knowledges of ways of approaching the world, were kept in subaltern positions. They didn't change very much their position when colonization ended formally and they were independent. It wasn't that suddenly the indigenous peoples in Argentina or in Chile or in Bolivia gained power. They were kept in the same or in similar subaltern positions. And this classification of the population, so what we see is that the classification of population on the basis of race was and still is the epistemic base of coloniality. And by coloniality, what these authors, Mignolo, Dussel, etc., that I mentioned, mean is a way of keeping together the colonial and the post-colonial. What they argue in a way is that there's not such thing as a post-colonial. We're still experiencing this coloniality of power. So basically, if you were not white, if you were not Western white, you were in a subaltern position. But whiteness, it didn't work exclusively as a way of repressing, but also with seduction. So whiteness was not only a question of the color of your skin, then this was very different in Latin America, where the Spanish mingled much more with the indigenous communities, and there were a lot of what they called mestizos, mixed race. So there was an imaginary of whiteness. It depended not so much on your color of your skin, or not only the color of your skin, but also on how you behaved, how you dressed, how you spoke, the kind of conduct you had. So when we look at all of, so I'll stop here, but is it clear? So now I'm going to get into Bolivia and Argentina, and we're going to look at how these processes of modernization in Bolivia, process of modernization in Argentina, and then we're going to look at how respect for diversity is being interpreted now. I hope I'm not driving you crazy with too much information, but there'll be time for conversation afterwards. So a few things, vignettes about processes of modernization. So this, you have to think, independence in Latin America in most countries was around the early 1800s. Okay, so Argentina was 1816, Bolivia, I don't remember exactly when, but around the same time. And what you had and what you still have in Bolivia is that you have 62%, that's more like now, or a few decades ago, 62% of indigenous people in Bolivia, which represent 30 different communities with different languages, different ways of being. So again, this notion of indigenous is also a very colonial, going back to the notion of discourse and how we think about the world, how we define the world. When we use the notion of indigenous communities, like they use here in Australia, for example, to talk about the Aboriginal people, basically, it's a very colonial way. So what does indigenous mean? In many ways, indigenous means not European in our common language. No, I always ask, well, so who are the indigenous people of England or France? Well, it's not we don't use that note. I mean, of course, there are indigenous people in England and France, but we don't use usually the notion of indigenous to refer to them. So in Bolivia, you have to think of a country where most people, by far most people, were not white, were indigenous, although they didn't necessarily all get along very well, they didn't necessarily always be a unified group, but they were very far from being dominant politically. The history of Bolivia is very strong because they have such a big indigenous community, is very strongly marked by this coloniality of power. There was imposition of Spanish, so students in schools, for example, if they didn't speak in Spanish, they were physically they were hit, and they were having like they were punished physically. Okay, so there was repression of indigenous languages and of course indigenous knowledges. There was nothing that being taught in schools. Well, I don't know, nothing, but very little things were able to come into the schools. It was mainly Western knowledge. And of course, indigenous communities were excluded from higher education, while the Creole elite, so the sons and daughters of the Spanish and the Europeans, appropriated its Western knowledge and education. And it's very interesting when you look at the history of education in Bolivia, how the possibility of expanding the system was being debated, because on the one hand, the powerful whites that were in charge of the state had very big debates. Some of them wanted to expand the educational system to every community in Bolivia. But others were, because they wanted to civilize the country. They thought, well, if we expand and we educate these people, we'll modernize, we'll become more productive, we'll be part of the economy, the global economy. So we need to expand it. But others were scared. They said, well, be careful. Knowledge is power. If we educate them, and if they get all this Western knowledge, they might stand against us. So that's dangerous. But the same kind of debate happened at the indigenous communities. On the one hand, some of them wanted schools and they wanted Western education, but others rejected it. So there was all these debates, and in this context, the educational expansion was very slow, unstable, and fragmented. So the educational system was very weak. It happened in some parts, but not in most of the country. I'm just giving you a panorama to then see how all of this is going to be relevant when we look at how respect for diversity is being interpreted in Argentina, in Bolivia. Now let's look at Argentina. Argentina has a very, very different demographics, or had at that time when compared to Bolivia. And basically that had to do with a very strong strategy of promoting European immigration as a strategy to what they called at that time to civilize the country. So the two very strong strategies that Argentina used to become a civilized country, and again, I'm not doing it, but I assume you understand that what I mean civilized in that those times was being a Western style country, was immigration and education. There were debates about which one was more important, and Alberdi, one of the one who wrote the Constitution, said like every immigrant that comes to our country has more knowledge than 1,000 books. And Sarmiento, that is the founder of the educational system, said, yeah, that's fine, but we need to educate them. So there was a lot of discussion, but both of them and most of the elite at that time agreed that these two were the main pillars of the construction of a modern Argentina. And one of the big slogans, a book written by Sarmiento, that is the founding father of the Argentine educational system, was Civilización y Barbarie, civilization and barbarism. And of course, the barbarians were the indigenous people, and civilization were the Europeans. So Argentina had a very, very quick development of its educational system, reaching most parts of the country. And it was very much based on copying the French system and on the notion of the French Republican ethos of equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity at those times meant giving every student exactly the same educational experience, of trying to give them exactly the same educational experience. The myth, of course, this is not true, but the myth is that the Minister of Education could look at his clock and say, at this time, every student in every school in the country is reading this exercise from this book. So every school would behave exactly as if it was exactly the same school. Every teacher would behave exactly as it was. They were talking about teachers that were replaceable. So And the main task of those schools was to promote a national identity very much based on Europeanness, but on the other hand, rejecting the survival of the cultures of each of the different European communities that had come to Argentina. Just to give you an idea, by the end of the 19th century, 2/3 of the population of the city of Buenos Aires were foreigners. Mostly Europe. I mean, there were a few from other countries of Latin America. So just to give you an idea of the level of immigration, I mean, it was basically in proportional terms, more Europeans went to Argentina than to the US. Not in absolute terms, but in proportional terms at those times. So the notion of promoting a national identity through homogeneity, through giving everybody, so you can start seeing how, well, this doesn't go very well with the notion of respect for diversity. Respect for diversity became a problem in Argentina. So, and of course, going back to this modernization process, the historical narratives excluded indigenous groups. There's a very famous saying in Argentina from those times, well, not, it's later on, but that says, los argentinos descienden de los barcos. Argentinians descend from boats. Of course, the logic behind that is that there's no indigenous people in Argentina, or there was no indigenous people in Argentina, which of course is demographically completely wrong. Argentina has proportionally more indigenous people than Brazil, for example. So Argentina was constructed discursively as a European enclave in South America, kind of, and that's interesting to compare for me now with Australia. Like it's two like dislocated, historically dislocated countries, no? So similar Australia, but with Asia, no? Like they're located in different parts, but they felt very European, and this gave Argentina an idea of an image of superiority towards other Latin Americans, and I'm sure that Xavi can tell a few jokes about that later on, or Mauro for that case. So what happened in the 1990s when this notion of respect for diversity, and I'm starting to finish here, so for the organizers, don't get too worried. What happened when the notion of respect for diversity arrived or was transferred to these two places? What is interesting in Bolivia, and a spoiler is the interesting case here is Bolivia, is that Western knowledge and these global discourses have been the source of power knowledge of the Bolivian elites. So the Bolivian elites, one way in which they discursively kept their power was saying, we are the ones that bring modernization, we bring civilization, we are the ones that bring what's happening in the world. But suddenly what's happening in the world is respect for diversity, and it completely turned against them, because of course, respect for diversity, there was no other way of reading it in Bolivia that respect the rights of the indigenous communities. So it empowered, of course, there were many claims for recognition of indigenous movements, but this respect for diversity became a very powerful discourse for them to gain power in Bolivian politics and society. So in 1994, we can see the first educational reform based on the notion of interculturality. So it's the first time that the education system gets reformed in Bolivia with an idea of including not only indigenous communities, but also indigenous knowledges. And as Luix and Lopez, that are two very good Bolivian scholars, say, it was the most comprehensive effort to date to break with a civilizatory project that made the destruction of indigenous identity one of the school's central objectives. And what's interesting is that in theory, it was saying that all schools, even schools that had all white kids, had to learn about the indigenous communities. Probably they didn't, but at least I don't know exactly what happened in each school, of course. And this was part of a radical political restructuring that altered the notion of Bolivia and Bolivian culture completely. I mean, Bolivia, and it's down here, changed its name. Now it's called the Plurinational State of Bolivia, okay? In 2005, Evo Morales became the first indigenous president. Before, in the 1990s, they had the first indigenous vice president. And there was a constitutional reform that stresses linguistic and cultural plurality of Bolivia. So again, I'm not claiming that respect for diversity is the only factor important here, but respect for diversity contributed in many ways to this move. Bolivia is moving steadily in the direction of empowering indigenous groups vis-a-vis Creole elites. There's a lot to do, but it's moving steadily in that direction. And the weakening of this group by the global slogan of respect for diversity seems to have had a fundamental role in this realignment of political power. Okay, so what we can see in Bolivia again is a very big shift in the way in which Bolivia thinks about themselves, and a very big shift in the educational system in particular, with the introduction of indigenous communities. What happened in Argentina? Well, the effects of the slogan were much weaker and dispersed. In a place where the notion of equality of opportunity and this idea of homogeneity was so strong, it was very difficult to change. So in the 1990s up to now, we start seeing some references to the notion of respect for diversity, some kind of rhetoric about the recognition of indigenous cultures, but honestly, very little happening in reality. I mean, some things happening, but nothing that really restructured the educational system. And what you see in general is a very localized approach to respect for diversity. So I did some empirical work in schools, for example, and teachers will talk about respect for diversity in terms of the kind of diversity they have in their schools. So if they have a few indigenous students, they might talk about that. If they have whatever students from Bolivia, they might talk about that. Or if they have gay students, they might talk about that. But there's no like kind of a clear political way in which this has been interpreted. And as I mentioned before, having had such a great growth of poverty, many times respect for diversity has been interpreted as respect for poverty, and there's some interesting work being done about that, about how teachers, middle-class teachers, will define in many ways the ways of being of very poor communities as a kind of culture that needed to be respected. So there's a lot of contradiction. So we want to fight against inequality, but we want to respect for diversity. And how does that work? Again, Mauro might have some examples of that. Maybe he did some very interesting work in poor neighborhoods in the city of Buenos Aires. So respect for diversity clashed with the French Republican ethos of equality, and it has never really entered very well into the educational system in Argentina. It also clashed with these historical narratives. Of course, at the same time, what we can see is that immigration in Argentina, in Buenos Aires in particular, from all of these, from Bolivia, from Peru, has created many ethnic tensions in schools, because now there is a lot of much more visible Latin American indigenous communities. So there's a lot happening there, but overall, there wasn't many major redefinition of the educational system based on the notion of respect for diversity, but rather localized and superficial effects. So getting to the conclusions. One of the things that I tried to show is that global discourses and their slogans are not only coded in very complex ways through these processes of being abstracted from historical experiences, but also they are decoded and enacted in intricate ways in different places. So we have to look at how these discourses, these ideas get, in Bob's terms, transferred, translated, and transformed very, very differently in different parts of the world. But even when we look at places like Bolivia, Argentina, or Cyprus, or Spain, or Barcelona, or Germany, even within those places, there's going to be different, or there might be different groups or different power groups that might use these discourses in different ways to earn power and to gain power, or to strengthen their position. So we have to pay attention also to which in this process of translation, which are the different actors that are trying to appropriate these global slogans to defend their own interests. And it's not only the discourse that is translated, but there's also an interpretation of the culture, the politics, etc., of the site of reception. So this context of reception, so there's a reading of, okay, so again, in Bolivia, the reading is very clear. Most of the population is indigenous. Respect for diversity cannot negate the power and the rights of those people. But in other parts of the world, it might be read in different places. The other point I want to make is that we need to think about, and of course, I might be wrong with this, but I think we need to think about these global discourses as a kind of scaffolding, one on top of the other. So what we have is this process of modernization that we have the colonial, what I showed very quickly today, but you have the colonial discourses that define the population, distribute power in a certain way. On top of that, you got processes of independence and modernization. And on top of that, or maybe on top is not the right word, but mingling with that, you get these new global discourses such as respect for diversity. And how the new global discourse is interpreted is going to depend very much on what happened with the previous one. And finally, the last point I want to make, and I think I tried to show you quite clearly in this case, is that we have to avoid generalizing, assuming generalized effects of these global discourses. So, for example, one of the issues you see today is these discussions about neoliberal policies, no? And we say, okay, so you read the work of English scholars about the destruction of the educational system through neoliberal policies, but sometimes they are analyzing places where there was no educational system before. So it's not I'm defending neoliberal policy in any way, but what I mean to say is that we cannot generalize. And again, if you look at, for example, low-fee private schools for the poor in some of the most poor areas in the world, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, that I don't like it. I think it's unethical in many ways. But if you go and talk to the parents of those kids that didn't have a school and now have a school, they'll probably feel empowered by this. So again, the effects of these global discourses are very, very contradictory, and they empower some people and they oppress others, or that same people in similar ways. So thank you very much. And I think that's all I got to say for today. Well, I can still have a conversation, but that was my presentation.
Thank you, Jason. That was very interesting, very inspiring, I would say. I really learned a lot, and it gave me a lot of, let's say, food of thought. So let me add, as a, let's say, a native German, perhaps with a little bit of Scandinavian in there, who knows, that, for example, the notion of diversity, I think you kind of clearly split it up and put it into details, and how this can be interpreted differently in different contexts. This what Maya would say, decoupling. Basically, we all talk about diversity, but we talk about this in a different way. And for example, in a German context, you could almost say that diversity, or the discourse on diversity, is dominated by a discourse about gender diversity. So the term as such is very much connotated with LGBTQ+, with the way you talk, the way you write in academic contexts, whether you add what we call the star to make sure that everyone is somehow represented independently of what gender diversity you have. So very different, let's say, discourse from what you just presented in terms of the notion of diversity. So yeah, very interesting talk. Thanks a lot. So
yeah,
Laia,
also, sorry, I should add, Kristen, that I basically, I mean, I guess that if I would look, I looked at this issue like some empirically, the empirical part, like 10 years ago or more around. I assume that if I would look, for example, at the notion of, and I concentrate very much on the ethnical side of it, but in places like, I don't know Bolivia, but in places like Argentina, clearly the same kind of issue with language and how you name things, and it's in terms of gender is happening. So a similar, probably with its differences, but it's similar kind of issue.
Yeah, and I mean, just take into account the French context, where if there's a group of 1,000 people and there's one man, you would use the male version of talking to this group. And even in France, these things somehow slightly change, but not to the extent, for example, as we have it in Germany, where you speak in the female version, or you speak with a gap in between to make sure that everyone is represented. But also, I mean, in terms of migration, Germany, for example, has a long history of what we called here guest workers. Yeah. So the idea was that people come here as guests, work here, and then go back. And this has dominated the German political scene on how immigration looks like, or actually how the politics do not really integrate people, because for too long, this was the idea of, you know, people as guests. They're here for a certain time and then they go back. And so as Germans, we really have to learn what immigration and integration really means. But anyway, Laia, let me know, do we go directly into the student reflections, or do we have time for an open discussion first?
Open discussion first? Una hora hasta las 12. Yeah. Open discussion. You can open it.
All right. So I see that Helen raised her yellow hand. So Helen.
Thank you, Kirsten. I just wanted to say, Jason, thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk for me, and this is not really my area, but it overlapped considerably with what I do, which is inclusion in terms of disability. So we have very similar politics here and very similar discussions and discourses. I just wanted your comment on Cyprus is a very interesting case in point here. Maybe Lefteris knows better and he can say later. Here we have diversity or differences, ethnic differences, language differences, religious differences, used in a political way to split instead of unite people. Yeah. So how does that relate to what you have been talking to us about this morning? I just wanted your comment.
Well, of course, it's difficult for me to comment on Cyprus. I know a little bit about it because I'm a friend of Lefteris. He's made me read some stuff, and I visited. But overall, I would say that probably, and maybe Lefteris, you can pick up afterwards and expand or correct me. But in terms of what I was trying to explain theoretically, what I would say is that Cyprus is clearly marked by a very strong conflict between the two groups. No, so obviously the notion of respect for diversity that's circulating globally is going to be interpreted there within that conflict, and might be well, I'm sure the work of Michalinos and some other people. I mean, there's some reactions that are more like, if you want to call them, more cosmopolitan, but I'm sure there's others that are different and exacerbate the conflict. So again, and of course there are places where certain ideas or global discourses just will not enter. I'm sure there are some countries where, or some, maybe not a country, but some cultures or some groups where gender equality is not something they would feel very comfortable with. And although it has become a kind of global discourse, it won't come in, or it would be interpreted very differently. So that's the way I would think about it, but I don't dare talk too much about Cyprus, having Lefteris here.
Lefteris, you want to come in on this?
Next time you come to Cyprus, Jason, I'm gonna make you go through a test, you know, and examine you. No, Jason is right, Helen. I mean, when you were talking about the Catholic Church in Argentina and translating or resisting this idea of diversity, resisting to include the gay communities, the gay marriages. Okay, that would be definitely the case of the Orthodox Church of Cyprus. You know, resisting this kind of opening up the notion of diversity to include these people. But also the Orthodox Church will also resist to define diversity in terms of including the Turkish minority into an imaginary Cyprus, okay? But this, Helen, would be the case of the left-wing party of Agel using this notion of diversity to include the Turkish community into Cypriot narratives of Cyprus. So it's a very complex notion of it was used in maybe we can do some kind of research on that. These are my immediate responses, Jason. But one thing, and this is what I don't know, Kerstin, we are opening up to discussion now, or the students will.
No, we still have some time to respond
One
to this talk.
One of the things I would like you, Jason, I mean, in the case of Cyprus, we know Cyprus is a member state of the European Union. All these kind of discourses, they come through the EU, okay? So in the case of Argentina, Latin America in general, but specifically Argentina and Bolivia, I mean, how do you see these discourses flowing in? You know, who is doing the transfer, you know, in the two countries?
Yes, that's a very interesting and important question, which I don't have a precise answer because I haven't researched in particular that part. I mean, that part of the process with this notion. But as you know, I did some work on international organizations such as UNESCO, the World Bank, the OECD, and how their ideas were interpreted in educational reforms in Argentina and in Brazil, and afterwards I looked at Chile, and in less detail in other parts, in Paraguay, in other parts of Latin America. So though international organizations are very, very powerful organizations that diffuse this kind of global discourses. If you think about nowadays, you know, some of these notions are also diffused by private companies like Pearson and others companies, or that work in this global, what I like to call global policy spaces. You have NGOs, so you have, and of course academics, academics that travel and meet each other, and they come with ideas, and then they they do training for teachers, and they promote changes in policies. So it's very difficult when you look at these kind of discursive influences. I mean, two things I'm going to say. One is it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint, well, this is exactly where it came from and this is exactly how it came from. Having said that, it's really very, very interesting to understand the kind of language I'm using is a kind of the socio-material arrangements that are made to kind of promote these ideas. And a very important thing there is that it's not necessary. So for example, you have to look at money, you have to look at technologies, no? So when computers or those kind of things many times change. So for example, in Argentina, I did some research on Conectar Igualdad. That's a very big project that was aimed at giving one computer to every secondary school student. And that computer came with certain softwares like Microsoft, and it came with certain digital learning environments and whatever. And so in that way, you get like Chinese companies having an influence on the use of time in schools in Argentina. You get many different ways in which these influences and these discursive influences come. And it's not always, and there's always, well, I don't know, always is a strong word, but usually, is not only foreigners or outside actors, if you can define outside, inside very clearly, that are promoting the ideas, but it's also many times, as I mentioned, the notion of how Latin American elites were very much associated with European powers in the domination of the Latin American poorer people. So they act as mediators. They were interested in promoting modernization because it favored their own position within their own countries also. So there is always this. I'm trying to move away from these kind of binaries in, out, foreigner, national. But if we use that for the sake of discussion, there is always both sides of that promote these ideas. No, so you can think of PISA, for example, as a very strong instrument of promoting curricular notions of what is good knowledge, what is an educated person today. And of course, PISA is the OECD and it's global, etc. But at the same time, someone in Japan, in Australia, in Argentina, or in France decides that they're going to participate in PISA, and they're going to decide that they're going to change their curriculum to adapt it to PISA to do better in those exams.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I always like the example of inclusive education, and I'm talking about something Helen knows better about, but how this global discourse has first changed, you know, in the sense that a disability is not a personal medical problem anymore, but it's a social challenge for society. And with that, with the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, German politics, for example, in terms of disabilities, has changed a lot, because this convention was one of the conventions signed in a rapid time by many countries, but they weren't aware what that actually means or what that meant to the education system. And then gradually they had to implement that. And for the German system, it meant we have 16 different systems, because we have 16 different Bundesländer, so units which have to decide how to actually then install inclusive education. So you know, I live in Bremen, which is a Bundesland by itself. It's a city state, so it's small. It can react quickly. There are only, you know, well, a measurable number of schools which then have had to kind of install inclusive education. But before, and that relates back to what Helen said, there was a strict division. So people with disabilities went to schools with disabilities, and people without disabilities went to regular schools. And now it's inclusive education. As a personal note, my son is in an inclusive class in a regular school. And I once asked him, so, you know, what about the kids in your school? What disabilities do they have? And he looked at me and he said, Mom, they don't have disabilities. They are just a little slower in learning. And then I thought, okay, you know, now he taught me what inclusive education means. It's a completely different perception, yeah. And I was very thankful for him to teach me what this actually means and how this discourse had changed. I see Helen wants to come in on this.
I'm sorry, I won't take long, but I have a very personal example that's exactly like Kirsten's. When my daughter was 4, there was a child with severe disabilities in her class, and I was trying to pick up her brains, you know, at home, to find out what she thinks about this child that I knew was there, could not walk, could not talk. So I was trying to say, so do you have any children with special needs in your class? She said, no, we don't. So I insisted, and I asked again and again, and she was drawing. She got fed up with me, you know, at 4. And she threw the pen and said, listen, Mom, we don't have any children with special needs in class. We have children with children's needs in class. And that was that. I had been working on this notion for 20 years, and I hadn't noticed that special needs and children's needs makes a pun in Greek. You know, it's ειδικές ανάγκες and παιδικές ανάγκες. So it really sounds very similar. And I had never, so that was a very good, thank you.
So Helen, your 4-year-old taught you, you know, what this notion meant.
Yes.
Okay, who else would like to come in and ask a question to Jason?
Let's see, yeah, you can. All right, well, maybe we can start on some student reflections. Can you hear us properly? Just, we have the microphone. Great. Well, Jason, just to begin with, thank you so much for sharing a very interesting lecture with us today. A lot of us are eager to chime in, so I'll keep it short. But I'm Jackie Howell, and I wanted to actually reflect on something first from a personal reflection, and then ask a question related to that. So I'm an interesting case because I was born in Buenos Aires and grew up in the United States. So my mom's from Argentina, and then my dad's from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And then my dad's in the United States, and I did my schooling in the United States, but still often returned to Argentina and Buenos Aires yearly to visit family. And I remember as a child going and of course, my family is from the European, a result of the European immigration, with backgrounds from Italy and Ireland and a whole mix. And I would always find, I mean, I had only as a child seen this side of Buenos Aires. Returning as a university student, where I studied an exchange semester at La UCA, the university there in Buenos Aires, I came with a new perception, having studying in the U.S. The international affairs and global development, and began to ask questions to my family that were arising, and questions related to discussions of race and discrimination from this very much U.S. context and mentality, where these discussions happen often due to, as we've discussed, the historical context in the U.S. And these questions came about, and my family would often be like, no, like here we don't have racism. But then later they would make comments about los villeros, people from the slums and things like that. And I started pushing against them and starting these interesting debates at the dinner table about I feel like here these narratives have been constructed to how do you say, look away or not recognize this foundational or structural discrimination that exists, and this is just in Buenos Aires' context, and let alone the entire country with the differences, as we talked about, the indigenous populations that are more so in other provinces. So my question, just to direct it, relates more to this idea of, so within Buenos Aires, it's so stark, the structural differences. As you drive into Buenos Aires, you see to the right the las villas, the slums that are built one on top of the other, and then these huge skyscrapers, and you drive in, and then it's the Paris of South America, and the beautiful buildings, and that very European influenced culture, as you shared with us today. So my question, and it's related to also, I'm currently doing an internship within the International Organization of Migration, and we talk a lot about social mixing and intergroup contact theory as a form of fostering social cohesion. And I wanted to ask, like, how can this narrative of or back to your terminology of respect for diversity, which in Argentina and Buenos Aires hasn't been prioritized as much, or hasn't been spoken about, or actionable items haven't made within the education system to respect it. How can this begin to be overturned or directed, more focused towards it, if within the city itself there's so much division, and not just structural division, but also the mentality of the European Argentines, who kind of are blindside the communities through media, things like that, who put these labels on those who live in the villas, those who are more from indigenous populations, and look different, but then the city and people from my own family reject and say, no, here there's not discrimination. So I'm just curious, how can that be shifted? How can your role as a researcher, or how is that being changed, or what work can be done to address that? And I hand it over to you.
My short answer is I don't know, but it's more of a political question. But no, let me give you a more serious response. I mean, I think that as I empathize with everything that you say, and I agree. It's not only in Argentina, but in many parts of the. I mean, you explain it very well for Argentina, and I can understand it very well in Argentina. But these kind of differences are invisibilized, and many times discrimination is also invisibilized. So two things to that. One is that I'd like to pick up on one thing you mentioned, that is how let's put it this way, but your moving or your trip to the US made you look at the issue of race from a very different perspective, because in the US, and this has to do with the cultural politics of difference, where in the US you cannot understand differences without understanding slavery and without understanding the whole process of well, slavery and what came after that in terms of discrimination of the Black population and the civil rights movements, etc., etc. And in a way, and that's the beauty about comparative education in many ways, and what you're all doing now is that I always say that it's similar to traveling. It opens your mind. It makes you see the world and look at the world in different ways. It makes you understand that the ways in which you're taken for granted ways of looking at the world are not the only way to look at it. And it allows you to, so in your case, it allowed you to change your mentality and see Argentina in a different perspective. So, for example, I was talking the other day to my colleague here, Fazal Rizvi, who is originally from India, but came to Australia when he was 15. And he didn't speak very well English. He was Black, Muslim, well, from Muslim background. He's not religious, and he didn't have good English. And when he was in Australia, he himself interpreted difference purely, and there was a policy here in Australia, white Australia. So Black people could not migrate into Australia. He came in for some very specific reason with his father and whatever. And so he was the only Black guy in his whole school. Black, I mean, whatever, what at that time would be defined as Black. But he understood his difference purely as a linguistic issue. He thought that if he could speak good English, I mean, he never noticed in many ways that his skin color was different from the other kids. The problem was English. But then he went to live in the UK. And when he went to the UK, he found all of these Pakistanis and Indians that looked just like him. And there was all this issue of class and race. And he started understanding the world because the cultural politics of difference there were very different. So he started understanding himself in a very different way. And then he went to he wrote about this, and then he went to the US and it changed again. But what I mean to say, and before in India, it was purely a religious issue. His family decided not to go to live in Pakistan and stay there, even though they were a Muslim. So they were discriminated against because of their religion. So it's, how do you see difference? It depends very much on where you come from and what kind of lenses you're looking at that difference. So, and then going to a possible response to your question is, as an academic, what I can do is make this difference, make the differences visible, but also make the lack of reaction to the inequalities that those differences create and the injustices that those differences create visible also. So try to transform this notion of just a difference, but no, it's because what your family and friends were saying in many ways, which is the same thing that my family and friends would say. I mean, yeah, there is a difference, but that difference doesn't create any problem. It's no big issue. And what you have to try to show them is, yeah, there is a big issue because these people do not have the same, they're not in the same position. They don't have parity of full social participation as you have. So take a look at that. Think for a moment, what are your opportunities, what your kind of privileges are when you compare it with the life of that person? What would happen if you were born there and there? So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that can sometimes open the minds of people to see those things.
Jason, this is very much discussed under the keyword of structural racism in the German context. What you just described, does everyone really have the same opportunities, or are there barriers by structures which make a difference whether you actually can make use of these opportunities or not? So.
Yeah, and there is a notion in what these Argentine people were saying. There's a notion of racism as, yeah, okay, we're not the Ku Klux Klan. We're not go chasing these people, and we're not burning their houses, and we're not like crossing the street because this guy from a different skin color comes in. But when you look at who has the opportunity, it's completely distributed in terms of ethnicity. Not completely in Argentina, but it is distributed in many ways in terms of ethnicity. So it's that concept is really, really important, the structural
racism.
Racism.
Okay, so I give back to the students. Who's next?
I would like to say something. I don't know if this is as much of a critique as it is just my coffee thoughts. Because I am also from the US. I come from a minority group in the US. And so we do often have like these talks and debates about race and diversity. And it's probably the only single thing that I appreciate about the US is that there are Black academics and scholars and leaders that like start these conversations. But I was wondering what you would think about the idea that the reason why Bolivia and Argentina took such different paths when it comes to the right for the respect for diversity is because of the majority indigenous population in Bolivia as opposed to Argentina's majority like European population. And in that sense, like it has a lot to do with discourse, but discourse that has been provided for those indigenous communities to give them the words or like this voice to describe like what is happening to them, because for them it's not respect for diversity, it's respect for me as a person, my culture, my language, which isn't being respected. And because they are a majority, they can take that and push for what they need. However, in the context of like the US and Argentina, even though this discourse has been happening, the actual policies and steps it takes to balance that out doesn't go through. And one speaker that I've heard from the US, G2 Brown, I believe, he speaks a lot about how America never honors its commitments to diversity. There are court cases, there are policies that are passed for the sake of diversity, but they are never followed through. And another concept of like critical race theory, a tenet of that, a branch of that, is this idea that we never really pass these things, these rights for diversity or respect for it, unless it somehow aligns with white supremacy goals. So an example might be Brown versus Board. I think that's a very good example. One, it was passed because it happened during this time of one, civil rights, where people were, on the streets and stuff, but also alongside the Cold War, in which case, the US needed to show the rest of the world, like, we're not that bad to our citizens, And at the same time, white families were starting to fly into these private schools. So if they felt like their children's schooling was being threatened, they left the school system. And so it like worked out for them. And until now, US schools are still just as segregated or even more so in the North. And so I guess my point is just like that, yes, I believe discourse does often give us the language to kind of describe these inequalities, but I don't believe that it is effective in actually causing change towards the things that we need, and that the colonial powers are still maintained. And that's just sad. Yeah, that's all. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your point in terms of, I think there's an issue there that you're looking at this, and I understand it and I respect it from a much more political perspective. So you're looking at whether respect for diversity did the work that you want to be done in the world. And I'm looking at it from a much more analytical perspective, trying to understand, well, what happened when respect for diversity, when we started talking about respect for diversity, not because I don't have a political position, but because I do research and I try to, because I have a political position, that I'm interested in that, but I'm trying to understand what happened. And one thing that I would say is that it's very difficult in the social sciences and to a certain extent also in the natural sciences to establish causality and say this happened because of this. And this is the only reason that this happened, okay? So it's very difficult to say this happened in Bolivia this way because of this, and this happened in Argentina because of this other stuff. I think there's multi-causalities and there's multiple things that, so for example, the strong development prior of the educational system in Argentina, immigration, the ethos of that's my interpretation. I mean, somebody else might research this and might find something else, but the ethos of republicanism, where they had this notion of the just way of treating differences, is ignoring them and giving everybody the same. In Argentina, kids in public schools have to wear a white cloak, like, so everybody has to look exactly the same. There is this whole notion of that the way in which you treat, the most fair way of treating differences, and this comes from the French Republican ethos of égalité, fraternité, is ignoring the differences. So those are some things. But of course, if you want to look at more structural issues, we can think of power. And of course, so respect for diversity comes into these sites. And some groups who might have more power, for example, women or the gay community, might use these discourses in their own favor, and that might end up working for them. Okay, and that power might come from different sources. But, and of course, if you think about specifically of ethnic relations and what I was talking about, well, if you're 62% of the country, that gives you a lot of power. So if you're a lot of people, yeah, well, and you want something, well, at one point, the other people. So I completely agree with your point that you can't look at discourse exclusively as language. There is a lot of material issues that are going to affect that. So, for example, again, if you look at the example that Helen and Kristen were discussing before about the inclusion of children with learning disabilities or with some kind of disabilities into the mainstream classrooms, that has become a global discourse that has, in most countries of the world, promotes that. And you have countries like Germany, where I assume that, I don't know a lot about German education, but I assume that Germany invests, compared to the rest of the world, quite a lot in education, that there's good teachers, that is, well, I mean, when you at least when you compare it with Bolivia or with Paraguay or Argentina. And so, but that requires doing that relatively well, so that it works well both for the student with a disability and for the group as a whole to understand that requires some material conditions. And so you see in many parts of the world, very poor areas of the world, where these discourses come in, and schools that can't even resolve the issue of how to teach mathematics to the kids and don't have internet and don't have computers and don't have this, suddenly they bring 3 kids with learning disabilities and with some kind of level of, and I know it might sound politically incorrect what I'm saying, but it becomes an issue of these schools are trying to solve. So there again, the material, how much money you have to hire a teacher to come and help you with this kid that cannot sit in his chair for 40 minutes. It's going to change completely what you can do with one thing or the other. So, I mean, to your point, I completely agree that we need to look at the material and how much money, how many resources are put into this kind of issue, into education policy.
I just think
so, I mean, my talk was more about thinking about discourse and the power of discourse, but that doesn't mean that the material is not important.
No, it's just like, so it just aligns with this idea that it's only when it follows or it aligns with the goals of the majority, that's when these things happen. Because if we're talking about the discourse surrounding students with intellectual disabilities, so much of that is focused on how will this benefit the regular kids, you know, because research has started to be phrased around how like it will benefit, you know, intellectually disabled children. That's the only reason why it has started to become inclusive in schools. It's because it's so framed towards the majority, like it will benefit us. That's why we'll accept them in. And I don't know.
But I mean, it's you're right. But also think that sometimes power moves along. So I mean, if you think about the same issue we were discussing, but think of it in terms of gender relations. Okay, and think why have suddenly men that control the patriarchy and have slowly but steadily have been given more power to women? Well, because it's not that they wanted to, but no, I mean, so there is power struggles in every part of society or in many parts of society with different groups. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have, but you have to locate it empirically in different positions and look at that. Yeah.
Just to let me quickly add something to this discussion about inclusive education. You know, we now have it, yeah, in Germany. Inclusive education means that that people, students with disabilities are included in regular schools. But that's where it stops. So once students finish school, there is no inclusive workforce. Then in Germany, for example, with disabilities, they again go into special contexts where they can work and earn a little bit of money, which is not comparable to, let's say, what you would earn on a regular labor market. So one step has been done for inclusive education, but for the inclusive workforce, there are no, let's say, really good approaches yet, just individual specific local approaches to include people with disabilities in the workforce. So I think this shows very well how one global discourse, namely the UN Convention, has influenced how things are done in school, but there is no, let's say, follow-up for the workforce then.
Yeah.
I see your hand. You're next. Yes, someone's micro is on. I don't know. Maybe it's Laura M. Can you please shut this off, because we're hearing some voices. At least I do. Okay, thanks. D, your turn.
So just a thought and a reflection on the global discourse, and then going into like the transfer, translation, and transformation in a local context or regional context, whether it's fragmented or complete, based on different population composition of the country. One thought I was having is that wouldn't there be an extra step before the transferring, or whether you call it diffusion of this global discourse? There's like a channel of interaction in between. First, as in the global discourse interacts with like a dominant / major domestic discourse at the time, whether it's alignment, rejection, or a mixed type of feeling interaction that kind of turns into a more contextualized transfer, translation than transformation, is what I was kind of reflecting on this kind of model, because of course when these kind of diverse reactions or proactive kind of acceptance, different attitudes of, for example, for the global discourse, when we talk about, for example, PISA, it's very, well, different countries have very different attitudes towards reception or participating in this and that. I remember reading an article from, I think one of the co-authors was Professor Martins on the PISA reaction by the US. Well, at first didn't really care about it because it didn't really mingle with the domestic kind of the dominant domestic discourse at the time, which is what I thought. But they started caring because when China came in and scored really high, they were like, okay, we gotta probably improve on something because something's wrong. Because probably one of the the dominant domestic discourse was that we gotta, you know, like China is our enemy or whatever. They're our political enemy in a way. So we gotta do better than that.
Economic
yes,
enemy. Economic
enemy. Yes. So that's why we need to do better than them in education. So I think that's like a strand of thought that I was kind of getting in these kind of relationships between discourses globally and regionally or nationally concerning nations. So I want to hear what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you had great thoughts. I as far as I know, and in the different projects I've been involved, I've seen those kind of issues where what you have is usually, especially when talking about discourses about education, well, I guess with everything, but with these global discourses don't enter a vacuum. They don't go into a place where there is no notion about difference, or there's no notion of what it means to be an educated person, for example, if you talk about PISA. So I don't know, you can look at, for example, whatever, the Bologna's reform in the EU, where they try to change the whole notion of what is to study in university, what is a class, what is a program, a course, what is a bachelor degree, what is a master's degree. And well, I mean, that changed completely the culture of very strong institutions, for example, in places like Germany, and they didn't like it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, they were not very much willing to say, I'm going to change something that is very intricate to my own culture. So again, I agree with your point in terms of, and we can think again how this global discourse that we were describing I was describing about respect for diversity, it goes into Bolivia. And when it goes into Bolivia, in Bolivia, of course, there's a lot of political tension. And there is, I mean, it's not that this 62% of indigenous communities started reacting against the oppression when they heard the word respect for diversity. They had been doing it for years and years and years. So when this comes in, it kind of strengthens their position, and it changes it ends up with again, I'm not saying that this is the only factor, but a whole lot of factors that partly contributed to the fact that this is the way in which we are thinking about the world, change that way. And you go into Argentina. In Argentina, the kind of notion of difference that was being described by the student that talked, sorry, I forgot your name, that talked initially, where people think, no, here there's no racism, there's no difference. We are all the same. And so we don't need to really mingle with this notion of respect for diversity very much. So, and then there's all this Republican ethos of the best way to treat differences to ignore it, which is not that people are thinking about that every day, but it's very much within their notion of what is justice, what is the best way to be fair in schools, is to treat everybody the same way and not treat them differently. So again, this, I think I told you I did my PhD thesis about how how the reforms of teacher education in Argentina and Brazil, and how they interpreted some ideas coming from the World Bank, UNESCO, and the OECD. And when I went and interviewed teacher educators, and they asked them, so for example, how do you, at that time, the notion of a curriculum based on the development of competencies was very important, as opposed to a more encyclopedic curriculum based on facts and knowledge, on like factual knowledge. And when I talked to teachers and said, so how do you interpret this notion of competencies? Most of them would say, this is exactly the same as, so they would ask whatever, the Bloom's taxonomy, or they would talk about the rational notion of competencies in the 60s. What they did was they domesticated the new global discourse within a notion they already control and dominate. So this is the same of something I already know. So what does that imply? I don't need to change my practice. I'm going to do exactly the same, because this what does is reinforces what I already do. Okay, so again, that's a way in which I think shows what you were saying before, or some examples of how available discourses in a given context are going to change the way in which, are going to affect the way in which people translate these new global discourses that suddenly they're faced with.
Jason,
I don't know if
I can only agree. You know, when you were referring to the German example in bachelor's and master's degree, following the Bologna example, yes, for us it was a paramount, you know, shift. But at the same time, many new programs were designed after the old ones. So what happens is yeah, as I said, as Maya would call it, decoupling. You now call it bachelor's and master's. You now call it competencies, but the content is actually contextualized with what you know already, or what with the structures or the content you already had in your country, basically. But it has a new, let's say, name for it to some extent.
Yeah.
Anita, I see you're raising your hand. You're next.
Hi. So I just wanted to relate something again to the structural racism that we were talking about. I'm not from Latin America, But while I read the papers and I heard the discussion, I could relate on a personal level with these notions, concepts, and discourses, whom I think are still very present in modern Europe, if I can say so. And like there is a clear distinction between, not only between Europeans and non-Europeans, but also between EU citizens and non-EU citizens in terms of opportunities that are offered, but also in terms of discrimination that we face. I come from a very complicated country named Kosovo, and I can say that not only Kosovo, but like the whole Western Balkans and like the whole Southeastern Europe still faces continuous racism and inferior position towards EU citizens. For instance, I can share a personal example. During this master's, I conducted an internship in UNESCO, and after finishing the internship, I was offered a position of education consultant. Like everything was set and the contract was almost done, but then the hierarchical positions in UNESCO did not, like the higher hierarchical position did not approve the contract simply because I'm from Kosovo. And like, I was like, I worked there as an unpaid slave worker, and that was fine. I worked there full time, but I can be a paid slave worker. And like there are other people like from United States and from Israel who are not part of UNESCO now, who still work for UNESCO, but I can't because I'm from Kosovo. So yeah, it's very hurtful to see how deep and this discrimination are rooted. And even from organizations such as UNESCO and other international organizations that talk blah, 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 and like still promote education for all and opportunities for all, still face, promote and approve discrimination. So yeah, it's just sad to see how non-EU citizens and non-Europeans always feel like they need to do double work in order to be in the same level or approximately the same level as EU citizens.
Well, yeah, I don't have much to say that rather than empathize with your situation, and yeah, unfortunately that's the world we're living, and we have to try to change it as much as possible. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of racism exists and different kinds of differences, and different opportunities depending on your nationality, your religion, the color of your skin, many issues, unfortunately.
Here in Bremen, we had a research center which finished its work a couple of years ago. There was one project on borders. And in this project on borders, they also looked at where is who be able to go without needing a visa. So which passport allows you, for example, to travel the most? And I think in your case, it's the contrary. You know, which passport basically, this enables you to take on jobs and positions and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a very good example for this the structural racism problem in this sense.
Yeah. Well,
what did you find, Kirsten? Which is the magic passport? So we know we get it.
I think the Japanese was very good, the Singaporean and the German.
All right.
Yeah, but for example, I remember about 20 years ago, I traveled to Cyprus, and I visited a friend there who was studying there, and we went to the northern part of Cyprus. And for me, that was as a political scientist, you know, doing international relations, I found this was a very interesting experience to be in a place of the world which is not recognized as a country. I mean, Northern Cyprus is recognized by, what is it, Nigeria, Russia, and perhaps 1/3 country or something. So
only by Turkey.
Or only by Turkey, yes. Yeah, but that if I would have lost my passport in the northern part, I would have had to go via Turkey. I would not be able to enter Cyprus again. And yeah, and I mean, the Kosovo, luckily Germany was one of the first countries recognizing Kosovo as a country, but it's not the case for many other states. So.
Yeah, and there's other issues. For example, I got a lot of Colombian friends, and you're from Colombia. You obviously, once you get anywhere in the world, you're gonna be checked as if you were a drug dealer.
Yeah.
You know, it's like these constructions of. I mean, some are more structural, like the case of Kosovo, or others are more like a construction of the media, and so yeah. Or of course, I remember again, I was talking about Fazal Rizvi, my friend. He came to visit to Argentina when I was there, and I thought, I told him, well, what are you going to take for your wife, and what are you going to buy? And he was, he didn't care too much, but I wanted to give him, in Argentina, he make very good knives for cooking and very beautiful knives, and I wanted to give him one, and he said, "Are you joking? Have you seen my face? Have you seen my name? If I go with a knife if I enter Australia with a knife, I'm going to be in trouble."
Yeah.
No, and those kind of things, if you're not in that
Absolutely.
situation, you wouldn't notice. No?
A friend of mine with whom I studied at the European University Institute in Italy, he has a British passport and a Kenyan passport, and his grandparents are from India, and he's a Sikh, so he's wearing a turban. And he said after 9/11, traveling was very difficult for him. The same people who checked him before 9/11 in Florence when he was to enter a plane, they then checked him much more in detail. Although they knew, who he was, where he came from, but just because of outer appearance, they made a difference. Okay, who's next?
Yes, I would like to share also. So first of all, thank you so much for this lecture. I learned a lot, especially about the power of discourses in Latin America, which is like a completely different world for me, far, far away. And so since I come from the Eastern Europe, particularly Lithuanian, and like it's even more relevant to me since I'm from the Polish minority in Lithuania. My thesis about that, my work is about that, everything is about
that.
You're
from Polish minority where?
From Lithuania.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah?
So this is a very relevant question or aspect which we are speaking today, how the discourse matter and how those global slogans transfers into local context, and like how it signifies afterwards, and what instruments do we have to reinforce that. For example, PISA, which is also like doing the cuts like even on the ethnicity base, taking out of a lot of other important factors when we do that. So Lithuania was occupied, let's say, until the 1990s. So we are an independent country for 30 years, and the biggest minorities in Lithuania are Polish and Russian. So the perpetrators from the past. And it's like a completely different compared to Latin America, where like Lithuanians are embracing their own identity and nationality and don't have respect for the minorities they have because of the historical context and historical narratives, which matters so much. So I've been advocating for that, like to take into account, like for inclusion, because like I also have a bit of a difficulty to draw the line between the inclusion and the cultural language inclusion and the respect for diversity. So I also would like comment your comment on that. Where do we draw the line? Because like UNESCO actually just issued late last year, a report about the inclusion of education in Eastern Europe and the Central Asia. And I was looking through the inclusion ideas in Lithuania. It was only about physical disabilities. So there was a question, what about the language inclusion? It can divide, and it divides so much. And this discord, which is sold from inside the country,
by political actors matters so much and actually draws this division. And of course, it's very easy to say, like, let's have the respect and like what we were talking about, like, so can we do those big inclusive school, which like include not only physical and other disabilities, but also the language, the different cultures, to have everyone and celebrate that. Especially, I do understand like this Lithuanian perspective where they've been like negatively like or been occupied by those powers, and they still have this, like they're afraid to be open up, especially for the powers which which caused the war in those areas. So yeah, just a personal reflection, but thank you so much, because like it really gives like a perspective, like globally, how those global slogans fly, spread, and what, like how differently does it mean in a local context. So thank you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what I pick up from what you, I mean, thank you also, because I didn't know all of that about Lithuania. And, but I think it's interesting to think of, and I think Bob talked about this yesterday, I'm sure he did, about the forces of history also, no? And it's very, history takes time. It's very different, no, in different parts of the world also. But yeah, and even this notion of difference and diversity, you know, where, so what kind of diversities do we care about? And it's really has become, I think, a world in which, well, I mean, I just by looking at not looking in but listening and the stories each of you told me, the students that talked, and where you come from, and it's clear that we're in a world where the idea that we're still thinking in many ways as if though diversity was the exception and the norm was that we are all similar. And I think we are in a world where it's and it depends where, but it's becoming more and more clear that diversity is becoming the norm. So you have a lot of these people. So I mean, you're saying, I wonder, I mean, I'm not sure, and I don't want to, I'm just mentioning this to you, but if we all reflect upon ourselves and think, okay, and I say I'm from Argentina, but really part of my family came from Scotland, another one came from Wales, another one came from Italy, another one came from France. Now I live in Australia. Probably my sons and daughter might meet someone from Asia here. There's a lot of people from Asia in Australia, and then they'll have a kid. And so where are you from? It's a very, there's a lot of about this in the literature and in music and in TED Talks that are very interesting to think about. But it's become an issue where it's very, very difficult to define. But on the other hand, we have this still this strong aim to essentialize and say, okay, so you are from Poland, and you are from Argentina, and you are from this, no? And I don't know, I think that's what we need to change maybe, you know, and start thinking about human beings as human beings, and not worry too much about essentializing, no? There's this strength to essentialize. So you are this, and that's what defines you. Yeah, but you are many things. Apart from your nationality, you got a religion, you got a family, you got this and that, and you got a political position, you got an environmental position. There's many things that define you that is not necessarily your nationality. And it's very, I used to do an exercise with my students in Argentina. That was, I left them for a long time and thinking, okay, so what can you think that is a symbol that essentially represents Argentina? And I could never find one. I could never find something that they could say that really represents Argentina and not another country as well. No? So yeah, we eat a lot of barbecue and whatever. Yeah, Australians also eat a lot of barbecue, and they think they're the champions of the world of barbecue, you know, and we eat whatever, we drink vodka and this and that. And yeah, Uruguayans also, Brazilians also, and we speak in Spanish. We have, so it's very difficult to find an essence. And I know that in Europe, in general, you believe it even more, that you have this kind of essence about it. But there's a lot of historical books that show that it's not like that, no? But there's still this thing, I'm German, I'm French, I'm this and that. And yeah, okay, you were born in France, but we're all brothers and sisters, really, no?
Even yes. About Germany, we are not unified by German sauerkraut, so quite differences.
And Lithuania is actually very much defining by the language. They state like Lithuania is Lithuanian language. So it's very difficult to like infiltrate or go like or be Lithuanian if you come from a different linguistic background. But like then my question is like for the future, so what's gonna define the nation or like, you know, the nationality? So this is just like an idea for the future, but I'm gonna leave for others.
Yes, okay, hola Jason, soy Marina. I have, thank you for everything that you, thanks for everything that you've just shared with us. I have two comments. One that has to do with more political, governmental spheres, and the other one with research in comparative education. So the first one is that one of the global discourses that I've been particularly studying has to do with the SDG 4 and education and sustainability. And there's a lot of literature that says, that talks about this productive power that it has not only in the discourse or in the rhetoric of, SDG 4 in general, but also through quantification and policy instruments and tools that have set goals for governments to reach and metrics, and then some accountability or policy tools such as large-scale assessments to show or prove that they are moving towards reaching those goals. So I wanted to share perhaps a concern from having worked at the Ministry of Education at national level in Argentina and in Buenos Aires City, that has to do with the bounded sovereignty, or I don't know how to pronounce that governments usually have when these global discourses and tools, policy tools, enter the policy-making agenda, education agenda, and then the priorities shift from the local problems that we were already facing, such as, I don't know, secondary school completion, or indicate quality education indicators, which were really bad, to then shift and move towards these other external kind of priorities. And I was thinking, is in particular with Conectar Igualdad, that you've kind of studied that policy for several years, how sometimes this shifting of the priorities makes that a policy is actually ineffective due to, for instance, local or domestic issues such as the technological infrastructure or things. So my first question in particular has to do with how to move away from this, or if there is any way out to figuring this tension between. And at the same time, I'm thinking, like, in this case, with the Chinese software that you mentioned in your paper and everything, those were, and private actors being part of the policy enactment, that was part of the problem in terms of how the policy evolved. But then what if it isn't? Then should private actors at some point enter the policy process to solve domestic problems which countries or governments such as Argentina cannot provide to all their students in the name of ensuring the right to education? So this was one question that I have. And then if you want, I can just then briefly mention the second one, which is more of an epistemological concern in terms of educational research, in particular in comparative education, that has to do with what Boaventura de Sousa Santos would say, come on, try to bring the voices of the marginalized and all the knowledge that was not allowed to think, or I don't know how we would translate that, but how can we introduce new ways of thinking these problems without falling in essentialization of diversity and identities and these marginalized groups, and B, in a system, like, I find academic research very still with a logic very colonialist and very yes, expulsive of these groups which were not allowed to think, and all this South that is, as he puts it. So how can we also overcome this through educational research in comparative education? And that's it.
Okay. I have a few hours.
No.
You have a few seconds.
No, very good, very good questions. Very good questions and comments. I'll be very brief. I'll start by the end, which is it's probably the most complicated question, but also I can give you I can send you to read something, which is a good way of responding. But yeah, how to give voice to the marginalized in the world? It's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult political question of how to give voice to those that are marginalized without being condescending, without putting them in the position of those that need your help. So why do they need your help? No, that's and there's a beautiful book by someone who writes a lot of beautiful books, which is Richard Sennett. I don't know if you know Richard Sennett, the sociologist. It's called Respect. And it's a beautiful book, and I recommend you read it if you're interested in that. And of course, he doesn't give an answer, but he reflects on how can we address, if we are in a position of relative privilege, how can we address those in need without putting them in a position where we are defining their needs, and we are defining their needs. And again, don't look for a direct answer to that, because I don't think nobody has it, but there is a very interesting reflection, and it's a beautiful book to read. And in terms of policy process of the global and the local and the private and the or not the private, I don't think it's I mean, your question is more political than in terms of research, but I don't think it's good to think in those binary. I mean, if I would have to make a political decision, to think in those binary terms. So this is good because it's global, or it's bad because it's global, or I should be careful of this because it comes from a private company or not. I mean, I think we need to, I mean, one, I think that the global forces, there is an anthropologist, Anna Tsing, I think it's her name, that she talks about these global forces, and she uses the metaphor of water coming down from the mountain. And the water comes down from the mountain, and suddenly it finds a very strong rock, and it can't pass anymore, but it will eventually find its way through, and it definitely will go down to the river, and it end up in the ocean. So in a way, what she's trying to say with this is global forces find their ways to come in, and these global discourses. So I don't think that kind of resisting them in such a way is a very good idea or a very good political project, but rather engage with those discourses, understand them, and think about, okay, so how can we use this in our favor, whatever that means in your political position, and that would include maybe, well, no, this, we're not interested in this, and we're going to do this, but this is not good for us. That's how I think we need to address it. So usually in a place, I see Argentinians are invading this program, but we are invading, it might include myself. But usually, as you know, in a place like Argentina, you would have like a group of people that are globalists, and they would come and say, oh yeah, we should do everything, follow whatever, all the global trends that are out there. And then the next political party will come into the government and say, we are against globalization, and everything that's foreign is bad. And then, so if, and they will insult you if you, whatever, you speak in English. So and I think none of those reactions is very intelligent. I mean, neither follow the global as if it's such magical solution. Well, with lefteris, we heard Bob Cowen, I don't know if he mentioned this, but this idea of the cult of the cargo cult comparative education. No, if you haven't heard of this, did he talk about that yesterday?
No, Jason.
But if you Google cargo cult, okay, it's a very interesting thing. I can't add it to the.
He talked of advocacy comparative education at some point, which
yeah, but cargo cult is this notion. There was this notion that anthropologists found in the Pacific Islands after the Second World War, that they had, all of these people had these groups had received a lot of things from the different ones that were using these islands to stop their planes and stuff, and they created a religion where they were expecting planes to come and throw food and things to them. So they created this idea of it's actually an anthropological concept, the cargo cult, and Bob talks about cargo cult comparative education. That is, look, that somewhere out there is the solution to my problems. So I just have to go around the world, and I'll find someone who has already solved my problems, and I can just copy that and bring it. Nowadays, this is not so much about copying Finland, maybe, or copying Prussia, but it's more about this global, so UNESCO has the solution to my problems. I think that is as bad as not listening to what UNESCO has to say. That's my political position. That's not very interesting.
So I think time is up.
Just one more. That
is it possible to ask one more?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Jason, if Jason is fine with that.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. Hi, Professor. My name is Ana Raquel. I know it's super late over there, and I wanted to thank you for your time. My question is a little bit similar to, is Jason still there? I cannot see him. To follow me? Yeah, so my question is kind of similar to Marina's regarding kind of like the positionality when we're researching different discourses or topics. So for instance, my topic is related to sex education in the context of Panama. And you know, that's a topic that encompasses and comprises both education and health. And it also has human rights, gender, diversity, all of that. So in the case of Panama, it's really interesting because we are very like oriented like the US, but like when it comes to social mobilizations, we are like, it's very different. Like we don't have any, like mobilization is not normal, like social mobilizations. So sex education though, does mobilize people, but against it. So like in general, people are against the sex education that the UNESCO promotes, which is comprehensive sex education. But you know, comprehensive sex education has become super popular worldwide. And my question kind of is like, I as a person that like personal, I do support the implementation of sex education, comprehensive sex education, but I also understand why some groups kind of like want to differ or like back away from what UNESCO proposes when they claim it has like neocolonial powers, as using neocolonial, as it was mentioned by Morana, Dussel, and Juaregui. So my question is, how as a researcher, when talking about a topic that is so contentious but also so popular, how do I ensure that my positionality doesn't continue or these neocolonial powers? So kind of along those ways. Thank you so much.
Well, what I was saying is, what I would say in a short answer is that there is no way in which your positionality will not affect your own research. Mm-hmm. So rather than trying to avoid your positionality affecting your research, you should try and reflect how your positionality affects your research. And actually, if you're doing a thesis, for example, try to write about that. And there's a lot of very good examples. I personally read a few theses, and I recommend a lot of my doctoral students to do that, especially with this kind of contentious issues. So, okay, so where are you writing from? Okay, if you're writing about a particular subject, it's not the same if you're a woman or a man. It's not the same if you're heterosexual or if you're gay. It's not the same if you're from Latin America or from Europe. So it's your positionality is always going to affect the way in which you see the world. And what you should do, well, if I can give you an advice, is to try and reflect upon that and write about that, and then see how much of that goes into the thesis or not. But definitely try to think about that and try to share it with the reader, so that the reader can know where you're coming from and where your ideas are coming from, and he or she can also say, okay, yeah, this is very interesting, but it's obvious that she's looking at this from this perspective, and maybe she's missing that. So I'm going to do another piece, or I'm going to read this other piece by this other person that comes from this other position. So that would be my advice in terms of positionality. Not try, I mean, a long time ago, the social sciences tried to be objective, and this idea of objectivity was kind of being promoted and used. So you had to kind of keep away from your theme. But I mean, we all have positions about, and actually the reason why you're doing it, and probably, I mean, I don't want you to tell me now, but there's probably reasons why you decided to study that, and why someone decides to study things. So you always have a political position towards your empirical research, so your case or whatever.
Actually, that is a very good last word, leading to the session we have in the afternoon with the students. So, but before we meet again at 3, let us all thank Jason for I think very inspiring, and I guess we could continue for hours. But I assume you, Jason, you know, you want to go to bed now. It's probably very late.
No, Jason is
hey,
a party
Tony,
animal, Kerstin.
Sorry?
He's gonna go out now. He's gonna go out and have a bottle
So
of
whatever
wine.
you want to go, you know, we wish you all a good night.
You know what happens in we have to adapt Lefteris to the Australian way of life. Here it's like at 8 o'clock everything is closed. So I didn't have dinner yet. I'm still like kind of my Latin American identity. I'm gonna go have dinner now.
So
but
good night, and enjoy your food, and thank you again for a very, very great session, and also all the students for great questions. So
thank you very much. Thanks to all the students for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck with the rest of the program. And hi, Tony.
Hi, Jason.
Bye, Jason.
Bye.
Un abrazo.
Bye.
Gracias. Chao.
I need to pee.